Well, and of course, your grandfather was one who really put it together when Roy Welch. And I've always assumed, and you tell me because you actually know, but when wrestling was going through that period in the 20s and 30s where they actually did come up with the finish and the idea of working a program and a booker with a set crew of talent at a booking office that sent guys out to promoters in towns. But when Roy Welch probably was just because he got over in these towns and then was a veteran in the locker room that was asked his input on things or had finishes for guys and just sort of became, as a lot of times bookers do, sort of became one of the boys who just became kind of a leader. Is that pretty much how he first assembled that territory in that booking office in Nashville?
No, it's not. No, I don't know if you want to go. This is maybe another story. But if you want to, we can go on into it now.
Well, if you've got it, because I've always been interested in how I've seen obviously the Welch brothers were all big, attractions on the cards in those days. But then I see that Roy, it just seemed like that he had assembled a crew of talent there in Nashville that was working all over the South. By the time a lot of the other guys that he was on the cards with, they were still just on the cards.
Yeah.
How did it happen?
Okay, so when he left, he started his career in 1924 in Columbus, Ohio, and he worked about 4 years or 5 years, and he got a feel for how the business works and what was to come in wrestling at that time. And what he did is when he left there, he went to Tennessee, and there was no organized wrestling in the South, basically, during that point, because professional wrestling was just in its infancy, kind of,
Yeah.
Occasional event here and there, kind of like an independent show would be now. So Roy made up his mind that he wanted to be an owner. He was a pretty smart guy. He saw that the promoter is the guy that makes the big money. And he says, I want to be the promoter. So he went into Tennessee. And what he would do is he strong-armed his way into building a territory. And the way he did it, and I asked him, because I used to ride with him a lot as a kid, how did you build this? And he said, I would go in these towns where they were having wrestling. And he said, I would go into the building and get to the dressing room. He said, I would kick the dressing room door open. I would go into the dressing room and introduce myself, say, I'm Roy Welch. And you guys are none of you wrestlers. And I don't ever want to see you again impersonating a wrestler. If you ever wrestle for anybody anywhere here other than me, you'll not wrestle at all. And I would say, well, how did that go? How did they take that? So how did they take that? And Roy was a very tough, mean son of a gun. And even the guys that were big stars for him afterward, I used to ask them years later, what was Roy like? And they go, he was a killer. He said, you didn't screw with Roy, right? So I said, what happened? How did they take that? And he said, well, he goes, most of them would, he said, I would say, you take your tights off and your gear off and put it in your bag and get the hell out of here right now. He'd throw them out of their own dressing room. He'd say, this town belongs to me from here on, right? And so he said most of them would put their gear together and they would get on out, And I said, well, what about those that didn't, And he said, well, he goes, occasionally, he said, they didn't know who I was or anything about me. He said, you would have one that would stand up to me. And I said, well, what would you do? He says, and I watched him do this routine a couple of times. He said, I like to take my thumb, and I like to put my hand around their throat and drive my thumb into their larynx so they keep breathing. And he says, once I got my grasp on their throat, he said, I like to pull them up close and I will whisper in their ear. And I said, well, what would you whisper to him? And he said, I'd whisper something like, if I ever see you again, I'm going to kill you. You know, you are nothing. You know, he starts talking into their ears very, very sternly, right? I said, well, did that always? No. He says, sometimes it didn't work. I said, well, what happened after that? And he says, I beat the hell out of him. So I said, well, how could you build a territory that way? You didn't have any wrestlers, you know. I said, you know, if you're going to run them all off and you're going to beat the hell out of them and basically say this town is my town, how did you manage to get? He said, well, every once in a while, he goes, one of them some bitches would be tough. And he said, when he was tough, he said, I'd keep him. He said, I would tell him, you know, I'm going to train you. I like you, kid. You know, you're going to be one of my boys. And see, so I said, so you did that in one dress room? What'd you do? And he said, I go right across to the other dress room, kick the door open, do the same routine. And, empty that one, basically, right? And I said, and then I said, well, what's next? He said, then you find the promoter who's running that show. And he says, once I found him, I said, what'd you do to him? Because I knew he wasn't a wrestler, probably. He said, I did the old thumb in the throat, you know, drug him up there and whispered in his ear that you ain't a wrestling promoter anymore. And if I ever hear you running another wrestling match, you ain't going to like what I do to you. You know, he said, and I said, what it would do then? He said, I would go to the ring then. Now I've run the dressing rooms empty. So I've bullied the promoter out of it. He said, then I would go and tell the fans that, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Roy Welch, and there's going to be no wrestling here tonight. That you paid your money. They said they would scream, we paid our money. And he said, I don't give a damn. He goes, next time there's any wrestling here, it'll be under my tutelage and it'll be good stuff. So you won't come back. That's good. But tonight, go the hell home. That's how he built his territory.
And actually, and obviously this was the Great Depression and, you know, the police were looking for other problems besides, you know, strong arming at wrestling shows. But basically, Roy, as the promoter, Herb was usually the number one singles guy if they were, you know, using him as a single in a territory. But they had the first tag match Herb and Roy Welch ever held in Louisville, Kentucky in 1943, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
But they were wrestling stars, but also with Roy getting a stable and booking talent around and starting that booking office. That's pretty much why he brought Nick Goulas in toward the end of the 30s, is because he needed since he was still in the ring in some places, it looked a little funny if the promoter was also wrestling. So he had Nick to be the promoter and do the business.
Front man.
Yeah.
He needed a front man, and he needed a businessman that could handle some of the publicity stuff and handle some of the office operation. And he was kind of in charge of keeping the talent good and keeping the boys happy and taking care of the problems with the talent. And it was a pretty good combination, the two of them, because Nick was a pretty good businessman, a hard worker. And they together turned out to be a pretty good deal for him.
That period of time that you mentioned, the early 70s, when Nick had the original part of the territory, Nick and Roy's territory, which was Nashville and Birmingham and Huntsville and Chattanooga, and then the part that Jared had opened up with the talent, Memphis End and Louisville and Evansville, Lexington up in Kentucky. They were running at least a lot of times 3 shows per night in that. Actually, when they sent talent to Knoxville before you bought in, it was more shows than that because they were sending guys over there too.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, Chattanooga had periods where they drew 5,000 a week plus, and it was 52 shows a year, 2,000 or 3,000 on a bad week. And Birmingham was huge for years in the 50s and 60s. They did 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people a week, and Nashville 3,000 or 4,000, and Memphis we all know about. And so there were literally tens of thousands of people, 50, 60, 70,000 people a week buying tickets in that territory to see wrestling. And I've talked about a lot of times on the show, you'll concur with this, it was not uncommon for spot show promoters in those days to have a briefcase with $8,000 or $10,000 in cash in the trunk of their car headed back to Nashville on a regular basis.
I tell you what, on my 5th studcast that I did a compilation. I sit down and did the math, and just exactly what you're talking about. They ran 3 nights a week, 3 towns a night, 6 nights a week is 18 towns. If they averaged just 3,000, and you know from just those figures that you just threw out there that they were averaging at least that, maybe more, per event. So during his time frame from 1945 basically to 65, when he was just closing out his career and turning things over to other people, he drew 56 million people.
Good Lord.
In the South. Unbelievable. You know, and if you run those numbers, 54,000 people a week for 20 years, it's 56 million fans. Can you see wrestling?
It was just sheer repetition of those numbers in those mid-size and small markets weekly, year in and year out for so many years. Because before the northern end here was open, Louisville in 1970, Nick and Roy had taken over Nashville in 1940. Birmingham, I think they got in the early 50s. They'd had Chattanooga since the 40s. And they lasted for so many years in a row. The amount of people that saw a guy like Jackie Fargo, was just incredible. He drew more people live to see him than Elvis did when he was on tour, because of just the sheer weekly numbers were incredible.
Oh, it's truly amazing. Tojo Yamamoto. Think about Tojo. Tojo was a fabulous star for him in the 50s and 60s. Dude, big money. One of my studcasts, Tony Basilio he hosts it for me, and he's always on his computer, and I'm starting to throw out these numbers. We're talking Memphis, right? And I'm telling them about when Dad went there in the early 60s in Ellis Auditorium, and he's pulling up the stuff on the computer. And when I finish, I say that they're selling, I think it's probably 10,000 seats. I described the building, the whole deal. He pulls it up and he goes, Ron, yes, it's pretty amazing. You're almost exactly right about the capacity it would hold. He goes, I got another figure for you here. He says in 1956, whatever, I believe it was 56, that Ellis Auditorium, wrestling drew 10,000 people, and Elvis Presley drew 5,600. There you go. That's pretty well tells you.
As a matter of fact, and you remember old guy Coffee, Mr. Coffee in Memphis, who was around for years and years, and his lovely wife Bonnie sold the pictures at the gimmick table. But he was the manager in the old days, the Ellis Auditorium. He's the one that used to sneak Elvis Presley in on the stage where he could peek out at the curtain and watch Cor Combs wrestle. But I digress over that. But to this day, I think Memphis we've done the history on our program. Memphis, for a market that size, sold 400,000 wrestling tickets in 1974 for 50 shows at the Mid-South Coliseum. And that was only one of the almost 12 weekly towns that Goulas and Welch out of Nashville had under their umbrella at the time. So the point is, wrestling is the only sport, we've talked about this, where the economics have not kept up with other sports. We talked about in the early 50s, 4 of the 5 highest paid pro athletes in the United States were pro wrestlers. And that is no longer the case.
That changed dramatically. But I wrestle a lot.
As a promoter in your promotional days, also it was almost impossible if you had a pro wrestling territory that was established and you had TV, it was almost impossible to lose money. And it was very possible to make a lot of money. And now there's a few promoters, regular promoters that are making money, but most of them are on a smaller scale. We're the only sport or entertainment whose economics have gone backwards.
Yeah. And that's a darn shame. And it would have never happened if things hadn't happened the way they did and went down with Vince. And I guess that's a story for another time. But, that's, in my opinion, he took it the wrong direction, and it's a shame that where we are now.
We had the Boston Celtics direction or the Harlem Globetrotters direction, and we chose the Globetrotters.
Yeah.
But we still have great stories, and so does the Tennessee stud, Ron Fuller. Ron, thank you again for another great one.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity that you're giving me here, man, to get my name out there a little bit. And it's always a pleasure talking with you.